I commented this morning that I choose my scripture passages pretty far in advance because we use the lectionary to preach. And Sue and I were talking before service about the church background, and the lectionary is the Book of Common Prayer. It's what controls the colors of the church and the seasons and all these things. And so they have a guide of suggested scripture passages, but what comes with it is lots of resources and things that can be helpful for churches to benefit worship when you preach out of the lectionary. So when my first week at Riverdale, I chose all the way through Easter what I was going to preach. And I went through the lectionary and I prayed over those and picked lectionary passages. And so this week I had decided to do a psalm, and then we were going to move into Lent. And not knowing, when I looked at this passage this week, I had no idea when I picked it 6-8 weeks ago that we were going to be in a week where we had all of this tension and turmoil in our world. But to me, the Psalms are an amazing thing. And a lot of preachers don't like to preach the Psalms, but it's because they're poetry and sometimes they're hard to preach. Not like a story in the New Testament or the Old Testament that's easy to get into a story, but poetry can be hard. But I love the Psalms. And after COVID, when COVID hit, January of 2020, my job had been redefined, and I was made the communications pastor at our church, which meant I was responsible for everything that was online, everything that was a digital communication for our church, digital ministry. And I was the pastor to all of our people that worshiped through technology. Now, 2 months after that, our church got quarantined, right? All of the whole country, churches shut down and went virtual. We had no idea that was going to happen. We just were a church that did a lot of virtual ministry already. We wanted to be intentional about that. So 2020 turned my world upside down. I worked really long hours and spent a lot of time trying to help our staff and our church figure out how do we do ministry through technology. This is crazy, right? So by the end of 2020, I was exhausted. And Christmas came, and I had never had a busier Christmas than I had ever had that year. And I told myself, I got to do something. I got to figure out how to rest. I took 2 weeks off. I just said, I'm going to spend time with God. And what I did is I read a psalm every day. And I don't normally read psalms every day. I mean, I'll submit it. Like, I read them when they come up, but it's not normally my go-to. I like Old Testament stories. I like the stories of conquering the evil people and all that kind of stuff. I like the ones you can really get into. I like the stories. But I read a psalm every day. And what I found is when you read these psalms, you find connection. You find connection in who God is, and you find connection with this idea that we're not alone in our struggles, because these Psalms were written 3,000-4,000 years ago. And yet you read them and they're right here in our hearts. They are so relevant to what we're dealing with today. The emotion of what we deal with, our God has not changed. The world has not changed, and our Christian issues have not changed. And it is such a thing that we just have to look at it and say, how can this psalm speak to me? And just find ourselves in it. So I wanted to preface that before we looked into this psalm, because when we think about what's going on this week, I read the lectionary every morning with my devotions. And so I see this pattern happen time and time again, that something that somebody decided all those years ago became exactly what God needed me to hear today. And I think you're going to realize that when you hear this scripture unpacked. So Psalm 99, verse 1, the Lord is king, let the nations tremble. He sits on his throne between the cherubim, let the whole earth quake. Now that's the image of a powerful God, a God that's big, a God that's strong, a God that looks down at his people that are fighting and quarreling and just wants to come down and like take his hand on the table and go, stop arguing. Okay, that's the type of God that we're talking about. And you picture him sitting there with all of his might and all of his strength. And it says, everybody is quaking with his power. All the nations know him. Let the nations tremble. The Jews are writing this, but they say, let the nations tremble. Not Israel, the nations. They're all going to tremble. Which means that God's power and might is not limited by location or religion or culture or material possession or race or ethnic background. Like he is that big. But if you think about it, he created everything, right? He created the entire world. He created all of humanity. So doesn't it make sense that he would be a God that is still the God of everything he created, even though all of his creation may not know him yet? So God's reign is everlasting for all people, all time, which means his spirit works all times through all people. And we've been talking about Paul's letter and the gift of the Spirit and how Paul was working through the people in Corinthians. That's the same thing the psalmist is talking about. The psalmist is saying that God's here to make sure that the whole world knows his power. He goes on, though, in verse 4, mighty King, lover of justice. You have established fairness and you have acted with justice and righteousness throughout Israel. Lover of justice. I mean, we love justice, right? We love when something that is unjust is righted. That's what we're seeing right now. Right now in the news, we see things that we believe in our heart and soul is unjust, and we want it to be made right. And you could put that phrase on so many things. But the problem is that many times we don't trust that our systems are going to always make things right. And if you think about it, we want to trust our system, but if we go to take something to court and the ruling we don't feel like is a just ruling, we can then appeal it, right? Because we're just human. And humans make mistakes. And so we have to have a system to deal with the system. But God's not that way, because see, God knows justice way past any human's understanding. And God also has no prejudice. I debated using that word because it has so much weight to it in our society. Prejudice means so much, but in its root, all prejudice means is something in my experience that causes me to misjudge. So think about it for a second. My daughter, who is 8, I have learned from experience, does not like to brush her teeth. And so when she comes to me and says she's brushed her teeth, and I go, have you really? And she goes, yes, is probably lying. 9 times out of 10, she's lying about brushing her teeth. This is what life has taught me. Okay. I'm going to send her back into the bathroom to do it again. A prejudice is when I then believe that every 8-year-old child is going to lie about brushing their teeth because my experience tells me that's what 8-year-old children do. Right? Now, I may not be wrong in that prejudice. If any parent of an 8-year-old watches this recording later and goes, mine does it too, it's for real, right? Then we have a commonality. But we have made the word prejudice become very polarized. But what it is anything that we have found to be a common thing over and over and over again. And if we see it happen 2 or 3 times in other people, we start to identify it as a commonality. And then we start to expect it. But we don't even sometimes realize that we do it. And in this, it causes things to be unjust. But we don't realize that we do that because it's here subconsciously in our mind. But the good news is that God's not that way. God has no prejudice because 1, you can't lie to God. That doesn't exist. And 2, he knows us to the deepest level of who we are, that we can't fool him. And he never has to search for the truth because he always knows it. He makes every decision out of love. He makes every judgment out of what is best for us. And he has a goal of forming equality between all of his creation, because that's why he created us. He created creation to be in equal relationship with him. And that's his goal with every decision that he makes. Through God, we can learn social circumstances and cultural experiences to just love others. And I'm going to say something that sometimes is a little shocking to people, but if you think about it for a second, God loved us before we even knew what things like money and race and cultural expectations were. Because in the time of the very beginning of Moses, there was some cultural expectations, but the very, very beginning with Adam and all of the very beginning, there was none of that. He loved us in the very beginning of humanity. And that's what he wants to continue to love us as, when there is no division between us. So when we talk about being truly just, that's God. Now, if we keep going in the scripture, 6-8, Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel also called on his name. They cried to the Lord for help, and he answered them. He spoke to Israel from the pillar of the cloud, and they followed the laws and decrees he gave them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, but you punished them when they were wrong. This is a God that's relational. Moses and Aaron are among the priests, and Samuel called on his name. They cried out to the Lord, and he answered them. Can you hear it? They're in the desert. Moses cries out, God, we're tired of eating bread. We want meat. And God sends it. That's a relational God. He sends them their guide of the pillar of the cloud. They follow him. They know him. He gives them everything that they need while they're there. This is a God that wants to know his people. He listens. He answers. He guides. He directs. He forgives. He avenges when it's necessary. That's who this God is. He's the Spirit of God that wants to know and be known by everybody. And think about that. Moses and Aaron, they didn't even have the Bible, right? They didn't have this scripture then. So God's doing all this relationship before he even had this history book, because that's what the Bible is, right? It's the recorded history of God and his people throughout time. And we need that because we're thinking people. We're people that use our critical brain, and we need to use that side of our brain. So God has recorded his life with his people for us. So we have the wisdom of the ages. But we didn't even always have that, which is telling us that God doesn't hold anything back. He can work with anything. He can work with anything. He can work with literally just a tree if he has to. The people that have no access to the church, that doesn't mean they don't have access to God. They still have access to who he is, because he is here among the whole entire world, because he is a God who wants to be in relationship. And this is a really short psalm. And it's got so many nuggets in it. But every day he wants to have this kind of relationship with us. So when I read Psalms like this, I read these pieces. I hear that they cried out to him and he answered. I hear that they were forgiven, but also sometimes they received their consequences of their actions. That he is a just and loving God. He is a mighty and powerful God. And I sit here and I reflect on this, and I think that is my God today, the same God that all the prophets of old had, and the same God that's going to be here for 1,000 years from now. And no matter what happens right now today, and no matter what I'm struggling with, this is my God.